The iron gates of the Boston Ladies' Literary Society clanged shut behind Victoria Barnes with a finality that echoed through the cobblestone street. And she knew her life in the cultured East had just ended. It was March of 1877, and the crisp Massachusetts air bit at her cheeks as she stood there, clutching her leather satchel full of essays and speeches that had been deemed too radical, too dangerous, too honest for polite society. Her crime had been simple. She had spoken her mind about women's suffrage, about the rights of workers, about the hypocrisy she saw in the gilded halls of Boston's elite. The matrons inside had voted unanimously to expel her, their faces pinched with disapproval as they declared her unfit for civilized company. Victoria was 23 years old, unmarried by choice, and now utterly alone. Her parents had passed 3 years prior, leaving her a small inheritance that would not last forever. The society had been her last connection to respectability, her last chance at maintaining the life she had known. As she walked through the narrow streets toward her boarding house, she made a decision that would change everything. She would go west, where the land was still wild and perhaps, just perhaps, a woman could speak without being silenced. Within 2 weeks, Victoria had sold most of her possessions, packed 2 trunks with practical clothing and her most treasured books, and purchased a train ticket to Arizona Territory. She had read about the towns springing up along the railroad lines, places where civilization was still being carved from the desert, where the rules might not be so rigid. Seligman, a small settlement in Yavapai County, had caught her attention in a newspaper advertisement. They needed a schoolteacher, and Victoria had the education even if she no longer had the society's blessing. The train journey took nearly a week, and with each passing mile, Victoria watched the landscape transform from green hills to golden plains to red desert. The other passengers eyed her with curiosity, this lone woman traveling without escort, her nose often buried in a book or her journal. She spoke little, still stung by the rejection in Boston, still uncertain what awaited her in this strange new territory. When she finally stepped off the train in Seligman on a bright April morning, the heat hit her like a physical force. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a dusty main street, with the vast desert stretching endlessly in all directions. The air smelled of sage and dust, and something wild she could not name. A few people milled about the train platform, collecting supplies and mail, and they all stopped to stare at her. Victoria lifted her chin and walked toward what appeared to be the general store, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. She would need to find the school board representative and present her credentials. She would need to find lodging. She would need to prove that she belonged here, that she could make a new life in this harsh, beautiful place. The general store was dim and cool inside, crowded with barrels of goods and shelves stacked with everything from canned food to mining equipment. A portly man behind the counter looked up as she entered, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I am looking for Mr. Henderson, the school board chairman," Victoria said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "I am Victoria Barnes, the new schoolteacher." The man's surprise deepened. "You came all the way from back east by yourself." "I did," Victoria confirmed, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Is Mr. Henderson available?" "He is, but—" The man hesitated. "Miss, I should tell you there has been some discussion about your appointment. Some folks think a woman alone might not be suitable for the position." Victoria felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. "I have excellent references and a thorough education. I am more than capable of teaching children to read and write." Before the shopkeeper could respond, The door opened behind her, and she turned to see a tall man entering, his figure momentarily silhouetted against the bright sunlight. As her eyes adjusted, she took in his appearance. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore dusty work clothes and a worn hat, and there was something both rugged and gentle in his features. "Morning, Walter," the man said to the shopkeeper, his voice a low drawl that carried the accent of the West. Then his eyes found Victoria, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of interest and curiosity. "Morning, Hayes," Walter replied. "This here is Miss Barnes, the new schoolteacher from Boston." Hayes removed his hat, revealing more of his face, and Victoria found herself noticing the kindness in his hazel eyes. "Hayes Coleman," he introduced himself, offering a slight bow that seemed almost courtly despite his rough appearance. "Welcome to Seligman, Miss Barnes." "Thank you," Victoria said, feeling unexpectedly flustered by his direct gaze. "I was just asking after Mr. Henderson." Hayes glanced at Walter, then back at Victoria. "I reckon I should tell you there has been some trouble about your coming here. Henderson and a few others have been saying that a woman teacher might bring unsuitable ideas to the children." His honesty was startling, but Victoria appreciated it more than Walter's dancing around the subject. "And what do you think, Mr. Coleman?" Victoria asked, lifting her chin again in that defiant gesture that had become second nature. Hayes considered her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression he was truly weighing his answer rather than offering polite platitudes. "I think children need education more than they need folks arguing about who is proper to give it to them. I think if you came all this way, you must want to teach, and that counts for something." Something in Victoria's chest loosened slightly. "Then perhaps you could direct me to Mr. Henderson so I can state my case." "I will do better than that," Hayes said, settling his hat back on his head. "I will walk you there myself. Henderson runs the feed store down the street." As they left the general store together, Victoria was acutely aware of the curious stares from the townspeople they passed. Hayes walked beside her with an easy confidence, seemingly unbothered by the attention. The desert sun beat down on them, and Victoria could already feel sweat gathering beneath her high collar. "How long have you lived in Seligman?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to fill the silence. "About 5 years now," Hayes replied. "I have a small ranch east of town. Cattle mostly, some horses. It is not much, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from building something with your own hands. Victoria found herself wanting to know more about this cowboy who had immediately offered to help a stranger, but they had already reached the feed store. Henderson proved to be a thin, stern-faced man in his 50s who looked at Victoria with undisguised skepticism. His office was a small room at the back of the store, cluttered with ledgers and papers. "Miss Barnes," he said, not rising from his desk or offering her a seat. "I received your application, but I must be frank with you. Several members of our community have expressed concerns about your suitability." Victoria remained standing, her hands clasped around her satchel. "May I ask what specifically concerns them?" Henderson shuffled some papers on his desk. "Your letter of introduction mentioned that you were outspoken on certain political matters. We are a quiet town, Miss Barnes. We do not need troublemakers." The word troublemaker stung, bringing back memories of the ladies in Boston using similar terms. But before Victoria could respond, Hayes spoke from where he leaned against the door frame. "Henderson, the woman came 2,000 miles to teach our children. Seems to me that shows dedication, not trouble." Henderson's expression soured. "This is not your concern, Coleman." "It is my concern when good people get turned away for no proper reason." Hayes said calmly, but there was steel beneath his words. What exactly are you afraid she will teach the children? Reading. Arithmetic. Seems like you are looking for problems that do not exist. Victoria glanced at Hayes, surprised by his defense of her. She had known him for all of 20 minutes, yet here he was, standing up to a man who clearly held some power in this town. Henderson's face reddened. The concern is that she will fill the children's heads with radical ideas about women's place in society. We have a natural order here, and we aim to keep it. And there it was, the same reasoning that had gotten Victoria expelled from the society. She felt the familiar fire rising in her belly, the urge to argue and debate and make them see the injustice of their thinking. But she had learned something from her experience in Boston, had she not? Perhaps a different approach was needed. "Mr. Henderson," she said quietly, and both men turned to look at her. "I came here to teach children to read, write, and cipher. I came here because I love learning and I want to share that love with young minds. What I think about politics or society's structure has no bearing on whether a child learns their alphabet." She paused, then added, "But I will not lie about who I am. I do believe women have value beyond what society typically assigns us. I do believe every person deserves to be heard and respected. If those beliefs make me unsuitable, then I suppose I have wasted a long journey." The room fell silent. Henderson stared at her, his expression unreadable. Hayes watched with what might have been approval in his eyes. Finally, Henderson sighed. "The school board will meet tomorrow evening to make a final decision. Until then, you may wait." It was not an outright rejection, which Victoria supposed was something. "Where should I stay in the meantime?" she asked. "There is a boarding house at the end of the main street," Henderson said, already turning his attention back to his papers. "Mrs. Miller runs it." Victoria nodded and turned to leave, Hayes following her out into the bright sunlight. Once they were outside, she let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you for speaking on my behalf," she said to Hayes. "You did not have to do that." Hayes shrugged. "I meant what I said. You came a long way, and that deserves respect." He hesitated, then added, "I am sorry if this is not the welcome you were hoping for." "It is not so different from the welcome I received in Boston when I dared to speak about suffrage," Victoria admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I suppose I was naive to think the West would be more open-minded." "The West is many things," Hayes said thoughtfully. "It is hard and sometimes cruel, but it is also a place where people get second chances, where you can be more than what society says you should be." He looked at her directly. "Your voice deserves to be heard here, Miss Barnes. Do not let Henderson and his ilk convince you otherwise." The words struck something deep in Victoria's heart. Your voice deserves to be heard. It was such a simple statement, yet no one had ever said anything like it to her before. In Boston, she had been told to be quiet, to know her place, to accept the natural order. And here was this cowboy, this stranger, telling her the exact opposite. "I barely know you," she said, her voice catching slightly, "yet you have shown me more kindness in an hour than some people I knew for years." Hayes' expression softened. "Maybe that is the problem with knowing people for years. They stop seeing who you really are and only see who they think you should be." They walked slowly toward the boarding house, neither seeming in a hurry despite the heat. Victoria found herself studying Hayes when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with an unconscious grace, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, the thoughtful way he seemed to consider his words before speaking. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure, slightly worn but clean-looking. A woman Victoria assumed was Mrs. Miller was sweeping the front porch, and she looked up with interest as they approached. Mrs. Miller, Hayes said with a friendly nod. This is Miss Barnes, the schoolteacher. She needs a room. Mrs. Miller was a plump, cheerful-looking woman in her 40s who immediately smiled warmly at Victoria. Of course. Come in, dear. I have a nice room on the second floor. Are you here alone?" "I am," Victoria confirmed, already reaching for her purse to discuss rates. "Well, that is brave of you," Mrs. Miller said approvingly. "Not many young women would make such a journey by themselves." Unlike Henderson's skepticism, Mrs. Miller's tone held only admiration as Mrs. Miller led Victoria inside to show her the room. Hayes remained on the porch. Victoria turned back at the doorway. "Will I see you again, Mr. Coleman?" she asked, then felt her cheeks warm at how forward the question sounded. Hayes smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Seligman is a small town, Miss Barnes. I reckon you will see me whether you want to or not. But yes, I will be at the school board meeting tomorrow, and I will speak in favor of your appointment." "You do not even know if I am a good teacher," Victoria pointed out. "No," Hayes agreed, "but I know you are honest and you have courage. That seems like a good starting point." After he left, Victoria followed Mrs. Miller upstairs to a simple but clean room with a window overlooking the main street. As she unpacked her trunks, she found her hands shaking slightly. The day had been overwhelming, swinging from disappointment to hope and back again. But one thing remained constant: the image of Hayes Coleman's steady gaze and his words about her voice deserving to be heard. That evening, Mrs. Miller invited Victoria to join her for supper, and Victoria learned more about Seligman and its inhabitants. The town had been established only 3 years prior when the railroad came through, and it was still growing, still finding its identity. There were miners, ranchers, railroad workers, and families trying to build new lives in the territory. "Hayes Coleman is a good man," Mrs. Miller said, unprompted, as she passed Victoria the potatoes. "Keeps to himself mostly, works hard on his ranch. He lost his parents young too, came out here to make his own way. Reminds me of you in that regard." Victoria absorbed this information, filing it away with everything else she was learning about this place and the cowboy who had so unexpectedly come to her defense. The next day passed slowly. Victoria spent the morning exploring the small town, noting the location of the schoolhouse, a modest one-room building that looked like it could use some repairs. In the afternoon, she reviewed her teaching materials and prepared what she would say to the school board if given the chance. As evening approached, she changed into her best dress, a dark blue cotton that was practical but presentable, and made her way to the church where Mrs. Miller had told her the meeting would be held. Her heart was pounding, and her palms felt clammy despite the dry desert air. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to build a new life where she would not be silenced. The church was already half full when she arrived, and she realized with some surprise that this was not just a school board meeting but a town gathering. People sat in the wooden pews, talking in low voices, and they all turned to stare when she entered. She spotted Hayes near the back, and he gave her an encouraging nod. Mrs. Miller was there too, along with several other women who smiled at her. Henderson called the meeting to order and wasted no time getting to the main issue. "We are here to discuss the appointment of Miss Victoria Barnes as the new schoolteacher. Some concerns have been raised about her suitability." An older man whom Victoria did not recognize stood up. "I heard she was thrown out of some society back east for radical views. We do not need that kind of influence on our children." "What kind of radical views?" a woman's voice called out. Victoria recognized her as one of the women who had smiled at her earlier. "Women's suffrage, for one," the man said, as if the words themselves were distasteful. the natural order of things being questioned. "And what is wrong with women having the vote?" another voice asked. This time it was Hayes, standing up from his pew. "My mother was one of the smartest people I ever knew, and she did not have half the opportunities she deserved because of her sex. Maybe if she had been able to vote, to have a say in how things were run, the world would be a better place." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some agreeing, some disagreeing. Henderson held up his hand for quiet. "That is not the issue at hand. The issue is whether Miss Barnes can be trusted to teach our children without filling their heads with unsuitable ideas." Victoria had been sitting quietly, but now she stood, her legs trembling but her voice steady. "May I speak?" The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Henderson looked like he wanted to refuse, but too many people were nodding for him to deny her. "I was banned from speaking in Boston," Victoria began, "because I dared to say that women have minds and voices that deserve to be heard. I dared to say that workers deserve fair wages and safe conditions. I dared to question why some people are born into privilege while others struggle their entire lives just to survive." She paused, looking around the room at the weathered faces, the work-worn hands, the eyes that held both hope and hardship. "I was banned for speaking my mind, for refusing to pretend that everything was perfect when I could see the injustices around me." She took a breath, her heart racing. "But I did not come here to cause trouble. I came here because I love teaching, because I believe education can change lives, can give children opportunities their parents never had. I came here because the West seemed like a place where maybe, just maybe, a person could be honest without being punished for it." The silence in the room was profound. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "I will teach your children to read," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I will teach them arithmetic and history and geography. I will encourage them to think, to question, to grow into adults who can make their own decisions about what they believe. If that is too radical for you, then I will leave peacefully. But I will not apologize for believing that every person, regardless of their sex or their station in life, has value." She sat down, her hands shaking now that the words had been spoken. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hayes stood again. "Miss Barnes is right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "She has as much right to speak her mind as any of us. Maybe more so because she has the education and the courage to say what needs saying. I have a ranch to run, and I need help sometimes, and do you know who I hire? Anyone willing to work hard, whether they are man or woman, old or young. What matters is their character and their effort, not what some folks back east think is proper." He turned to look directly at Victoria, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Your voice deserves to be heard here, Miss Barnes, and if the school board is too stubborn to see that you would be an asset to this town, then they are fools." Mrs. Miller stood up next. "I have known Hayes Coleman for 5 years, and I have never heard him speak so passionately about anything. That tells me Miss Barnes must be something special. I say we give her a chance." More people began to stand, some speaking in favor of Victoria, some against. The debate went on for nearly an hour, with Henderson trying repeatedly to maintain order. Victoria sat through it all, overwhelmed by the fact that these people, most of whom she had never met, were arguing about her, her ideas, her right to exist in their community. Finally, Henderson called for a vote. The school board consisted of 5 men, and the decision would rest with them. One by one, they cast their votes. 2 voted against her appointment, citing concerns about her radical views. 1 voted in favor, saying the town needed a teacher regardless of politics. The 4th vote was in favor as well, the man saying his daughter deserved the same quality of education as his sons. It came down to the fifth man, a rancher named Thomas who had been silent throughout most of the meeting. He stood slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "I fought in the war," Thomas said quietly. "I saw men die for the idea that all people should be free. I cannot in good conscience deny this woman a job because she believes something similar about her own sex. She has my vote." The decision was made. Victoria Barnes would be the new schoolteacher of Seligman, Arizona Territory, starting in 2 weeks when the school term began. As people filed out of the church, several came up to shake Victoria's hand or welcome her properly to the town. But it was Hayes she found herself looking for, and when she spotted him waiting near the door, she felt a rush of relief and something else she was not quite ready to name. "Thank you," she said when she reached him. The words felt inadequate for what he had done, for how he had stood up for her when he barely knew her. "You did the hard part," Hayes said. "You spoke your truth. I just backed you up." They walked out into the cool evening air, the desert sky blazing with stars unlike anything Victoria had ever seen in Boston. The vastness of it made her feel both small and somehow freer than she had ever felt before. "Can I walk you back to the boarding house?" Hayes asked. "I would like that," Victoria replied. They walked slowly, in no hurry despite the late hour. Victoria found herself telling Hayes about Boston, about her parents' death, about the slow suffocation of trying to fit into a society that demanded she be silent and decorative rather than thoughtful and honest. "I spent 3 years trying to be what they wanted," she said, "but I could not do it anymore. When I read about the injustices, about the children working in factories, about women with no legal rights, I had to speak. I had to say something, even if it meant losing everything." "That took courage," Hayes said simply. "More courage than most people have." "It did not feel courageous," Victoria admitted. "It felt necessary, like holding my tongue would have poisoned me from the inside." Hayes nodded understanding. "I know that feeling. When I came out here, my uncle wanted me to stay back east, take over his business. But I could not spend my life doing work that did not mean anything to me, just for the sake of security. Out here, when I look at my land, at the cattle I have raised, I know it is mine. I built it. That matters." They had reached the boarding house, but neither moved to end the conversation. Victoria looked up at Hayes in the starlight, seeing the strength in his features, the integrity that seemed to radiate from him. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. "You could have stayed silent, let the board make their decision without getting involved. It would have been easier." Hayes was quiet for a moment, his gaze holding hers. "Because when you walked into that general store yesterday, you looked like you had been beaten down but refused to stay down. You looked like you had fight left in you. And because when you spoke at that meeting tonight, you said things I have thought but never had the words for. You made me believe that maybe this territory could be different, better than the places we left behind." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and gratitude and something deeper she was beginning to recognize as attraction. "I am glad I met you, Hayes Coleman." "I am glad you came to Seligman, Victoria Barnes," he replied, and the use of her first name sent a small thrill through her. That night, lying in her bed at the boarding house, Victoria could not sleep. Her mind kept returning to Hayes, to the way he had looked at her, to the words he had spoken in her defense. She had not come west looking for romance, had barely allowed herself to think about such things after spending so long focused on education and causes. But there was something about Hayes that drew her, something beyond his handsome face and strong build. It was his character, his willingness to stand up for what was right even when it was unpopular. It was the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her words mattered. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria threw herself into getting the schoolhouse ready, cleaning and organizing, making lists of supplies she would need. Several townspeople came by to help, including Hayes, who spent 2 full days repairing the roof and fixing broken desks. Working alongside him, Victoria found herself noticing small things. The way he concentrated when he worked, the gentleness of his hands when he handled something delicate, the sound of his laugh when she said something amusing. They talked as they worked, conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical, and Victoria discovered that Hayes was far more educated than his cowboy appearance might suggest. He had read widely, thought deeply, and had opinions on everything from politics to poetry. "My mother taught me to read when I was young," he explained one afternoon as they painted the schoolhouse walls. "She said education was the one thing no one could take from you. After she died, I kept reading everything I could get my hands on. I reckon I am not formally educated like you, but I do all right." "You do more than all right," Victoria said warmly. "You have wisdom that has nothing to do with formal schooling." Hayes glanced at her, and something in his expression made Victoria's breath catch. "You have a way of making a man feel like he matters, Victoria." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, but then Mrs. Miller's voice called from outside, asking if they wanted some lemonade, and the spell was broken. Yet Victoria carried the feeling with her for the rest of the day, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. The school term began on a Monday morning in early May. Victoria arrived early, her nerves making her stomach flutter. She had prepared thoroughly, had her lessons planned for the first week, had arranged the classroom to maximize learning. But as the children began to file in, shy and curious, she felt a moment of pure terror. What if she failed? What if Henderson had been right and she was not suitable for this? Then she saw Hayes through the window, tipping his hat to her from where he sat on his horse across the street. He had told her he would be passing through town today, but she suspected he had timed it deliberately to offer his support. The sight of him steadied her, reminded her why she was here. The first day of teaching was chaotic but wonderful. Victoria had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they came from various backgrounds. Ranchers' children, miners' children, the doctor's daughters, the blacksmith's sons. Some could barely write their names. Others were reading at an advanced level. It would be a challenge to teach them all effectively. But Victoria thrived on challenges. As the weeks passed, she fell into a rhythm. Her days were full of lesson planning, teaching, and getting to know her students and their families. Her evenings often included visits from parents wanting to discuss their children's progress or invitations to community events. Seligman was beginning to feel less like a foreign territory and more like home, and through it all, there was Hayes. He came into town at least twice a week, always finding some reason to stop by the school or the boarding house. Sometimes he brought Victoria supplies she had mentioned needing. Sometimes he simply walked with her after school, talking about everything and nothing. A friendship was growing between them, deep and genuine, but Victoria sensed there was more beneath the surface, a current of attraction and possibility that neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. One Saturday in June, Hayes invited Victoria to visit his ranch. "I would like to show you what I have built," he said, and Victoria heard both pride and nervousness in his voice. She borrowed Mrs. Miller's buggy and followed Hayes out of town, through the desert landscape that had become increasingly beautiful to her as she learned to read its subtle variations. The ranch appeared gradually, a sturdy house with a wide porch, a barn, corrals holding cattle and horses, all of it set against the backdrop of distant mountains. "It is not fancy," Hayes said as he helped her down from the buggy, "but it is mine." "It is wonderful," Victoria said honestly, seeing not just the physical structures but the care and effort that had gone into creating them. "You should be proud, Hayes." He showed her around, introducing her to his 2 horses, explaining his plans for expanding the herd, pointing out where he hoped to build a better barn someday. His passion for this place was evident in every word, every gesture, and Victoria found herself imagining what it might be like to be part of this dream, to build something together. They ate lunch on the porch, simple food that Hayes had prepared himself, and the conversation flowed as easily as it always did between them. But there was also a tension now, an awareness that had been building for weeks. Victoria caught Hayes looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. She found her eyes drawn to his hands, his mouth, wondering what it would feel like if he kissed her. "Victoria," Hayes said finally, setting down his plate and turning to face her fully. "I need to tell you something, and I am not sure I will say it right, but I have to try." Her heart was pounding now. "What is it?" "Since the day you arrived in Seligman, you have been on my mind," he said, his voice low and earnest. "At first, I thought it was just because I admired your courage, your principles, but it has become more than that. I find myself looking for excuses to see you. I lie awake thinking about things you said, things you might say. I have never felt this way about anyone, and it scares me because I barely know how to run a ranch, let alone navigate feelings like these." Victoria's throat was tight with emotion. "Hayes, I know I am just a cowboy," he continued, the words tumbling out now. "I know you are educated and refined, and could probably do much better than someone like me. But I cannot let you think I am just your friend when what I feel is so much more. I am falling in love with you, Victoria. Maybe I already have fallen. And I needed you to know, even if it ruins what we have." For a moment, Victoria could not speak. Tears were sliding down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "You think you are just a cowboy," she finally said, her voice shaking. "Hayes, you are the best man I have ever known. You saw me when I was at my lowest and told me my voice deserved to be heard. You stood up for me when you had nothing to gain from it. You have treated me with respect and kindness and genuine interest in who I am, not who society thinks I should be." She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the warmth of his skin. "I have been falling in love with you too, trying not to, telling myself it was too soon or too complicated or too risky. But the truth is, when I think about my future now, I cannot imagine it without you in it." Hayes stared at her, hope and disbelief mingling in his expression. "Truly, truly," Victoria confirmed. Then he was leaning toward her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, and Victoria's eyes fluttered closed as his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking the spell. But then it deepened, becoming a promise, a claiming, an acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them since that first day in the general store. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have much to offer you," he said softly. "This ranch, a simple life, hard work. You offer me freedom," Victoria replied. "You offer me a place where I can be myself, speak my mind, teach children to think for themselves. You offer me love without conditions, without demands that I be anything other than who I am. That is everything, Hayes. That is more than I ever dreamed of having." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about the future, about possibilities, about dreams. Hayes wanted to build his ranch into something substantial, to raise horses as well as cattle. Victoria wanted to expand the school, maybe even start a small library for the town. They talked about how those dreams might fit together, how they might build a life that honored both their ambitions. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Hayes asked the question Victoria had been hoping for. "Will you marry me, Victoria? I know it is fast, and maybe folks will say we are rushing, but I cannot imagine waiting now that I know you feel the same." "Yes," Victoria said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding took place in early August in the same church where the school board meeting had been held. Mrs. Miller helped Victoria make a simple white dress, and the whole town turned out for the ceremony. Even Henderson came, though he still looked skeptical about the whole arrangement. Victoria had no family to stand with her, but it did not matter. As she walked down the aisle toward Hayes, who looked both nervous and joyful in his Sunday best, she felt surrounded by community, by people who had come to accept her despite her unconventional views, by the future she was choosing for herself. The vows they exchanged were traditional in words but radical in meaning. When Hayes promised to honor and cherish her, Victoria heard also his promise to never silence her, never diminish her. When Victoria promised to love and support him, she meant that she would be his partner in building their life together, not merely an ornament or a servant. The kiss they shared as husband and wife was witnessed by cheers and applause, and as they walked back down the aisle together, Victoria caught sight of several women in the crowd wiping away tears. She understood. This was more than just a wedding. It was a statement that love could exist between equals, that a woman need not give up her voice to be loved. The reception was held in the town square, with tables laden with food brought by various townspeople and music provided by a fiddler and a guitar player. Victoria danced with Hayes, his arm strong around her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. She danced with other men too, as was customary, but always she found her gaze returning to her husband, hardly able to believe that word applied to Hayes now. As the evening wore on and the stars came out, Hayes and Victoria slipped away, riding out to the ranch in the wagon Hayes had decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. The house was dark when they arrived, but Hayes had prepared it earlier, lighting lanterns and leaving the bedroom door open to the cool night breeze. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, an exploration of each other that went beyond physical pleasure to something deeper, a joining of souls as much as bodies. Afterward, lying in Hayes' arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Victoria felt a completeness she had never known before. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Hayes replied, his hand stroking her hair. "My brave, brilliant wife." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Victoria continued teaching during the week, while Hayes managed the ranch. In the evenings, they came together to share meals, to talk about their days, to plan for the future. Victoria helped Hayes with the ranch accounts, bringing her education to bear on organizing his records and planning for expenses. Hayes helped Victoria with school projects, building bookshelves and desks, even occasionally coming in to talk to the students about ranching and animal husbandry. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The desert could be harsh, and there were times when the cattle struggled, when money was tight, when the heat was so oppressive it was hard to think. There were also social challenges. Some people in town still disapproved of Victoria's outspoken nature, and there were whispered criticisms about a woman who did not know her place. But Hayes was always there, steady and supportive, reminding Victoria that she was valued and loved exactly as she was. For her part, Victoria supported Hayes through the difficult times, the setbacks and frustrations that came with building a ranch in unforgiving territory. She learned to help with some of the ranch work, discovering a surprising enjoyment in the physical labor of feeding animals and mending fences. She learned to read the sky for signs of rain, to understand the rhythms of the land. In the spring of their second year together, Victoria realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with both joy and terror. She had always wanted children but had feared that pregnancy might end her teaching career, might force her back into the domestic role she had fought so hard to escape. When she told Hayes, his reaction was immediate joy. He swept her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. But then he saw the worry in her face and set her down gently. "What is wrong?" he asked. "What about the school?" Victoria said. "What about my teaching?" Hayes took her hands in his. "What about it? Victoria, having a baby does not mean you have to stop being who you are. We will figure it out together. Maybe you take some time off when the baby is born, then go back when you are ready. Or maybe we find ways to make it work with the baby there sometimes. This is our life, our choice. No one else gets to decide." His words eased some of her worry, but Victoria knew it would not be that simple. Society had expectations about motherhood, about women's proper roles. She would be fighting against those expectations, as she had fought against so many others. As her pregnancy progressed, Victoria did indeed face criticism. Some parents questioned whether a pregnant woman should be teaching their children, as if pregnancy were somehow shameful or unsuitable. Henderson, predictably, suggested that Victoria should resign her position and focus on her maternal duties, but there were also supporters. Mrs. Miller organized a group of women who came to Victoria's defense, arguing that a woman's ability to teach had nothing to do with her ability to bear children. Several mothers in the community shared their own stories of balancing work and family, offering advice and solidarity. And Hayes was her rock throughout it all. He attended every community meeting where Victoria's position was discussed, speaking calmly but firmly about his wife's rights and abilities. He hired a young ranch hand to help with some of the heavier work so he could spend more time supporting Victoria. He read to her from her favorite books in the evenings, rubbed her sore feet, and talked to their unborn child through her swelling belly. Their son was born in December of 1879, a squalling, healthy boy they named Henry, after Hayes' father. The birth was long and difficult, attended by the town doctor and Mrs. Miller, and there were moments when Victoria feared she might not survive. But she did, and when they placed her son in her arms, she felt a love so fierce and overwhelming it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Hayes wept too, holding both his wife and son with shaking hands. "He is perfect," he kept saying. "You are perfect. I cannot believe how lucky I am." Victoria took 3 months away from teaching, time to recover and bond with Henry. It was simultaneously the most exhausting and most fulfilling time of her life. She discovered depths of love she had not known existed, along with a bone-deep weariness that came from sleepless nights and constant demands. Hayes helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Henry when he cried, learning to change diapers, taking on more of the household chores. When Victoria returned to teaching in March, it was with Henry in a cradle at the back of the schoolroom. Some parents objected, but most understood that this was the only way Victoria could continue teaching. The older students loved having a baby in the classroom, and Victoria found ways to incorporate childcare into her lessons, teaching the girls especially about proper infant care. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more complicated than before but rich with meaning. Victoria loved watching Henry grow, loved seeing Hayes as a father, gentle and patient and devoted. She loved her teaching, loved seeing her students progress and achieve. And she loved the life she and Hayes had built together, a partnership based on mutual respect and love. As the years passed, Seligman grew and changed. The railroad brought more people, more commerce, more civilization. The school expanded, requiring a second teacher, and Victoria found herself training and mentoring a young woman fresh from the East who reminded her of herself years earlier. Hayes Ranch prospered, growing into one of the most successful operations in the area. They hired help, built a larger house, and established themselves as respected members of the community. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Violet in 1882 and another son named Samuel in 1885. Each birth brought its own joys and challenges, but Victoria never gave up her teaching, finding ways to balance her roles as mother, wife, educator, and advocate for the causes she believed in. She started a women's reading group in Seligman, which gradually evolved into a forum for discussing social issues, including suffrage. She wrote articles for newspapers back east, sharing her experiences as a woman building a life in the West. She corresponded with suffrage leaders, donated money to the cause when she could, and slowly, patiently worked to change minds in her own community. Hayes supported all of it, even when it made their lives more complicated, even when it brought criticism from more conservative neighbors. He had meant what he said all those years ago. Victoria's voice deserved to be heard. He never wavered from that belief. On their 10th anniversary, Hayes surprised Victoria with a trip to Prescott, the territorial capital. They left the children with Mrs. Miller, who had become like a grandmother to them, and spent 3 days alone together, rediscovering each other away from the demands of ranch and school and family. On the last evening of their trip, as they sat together watching the sunset from their hotel window, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Hayes. "Marrying a troublemaker like me. Life would have been simpler with a more conventional wife." Hayes pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Simpler, maybe, but not better. Never better. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria. You made me braver, made me think deeper, made me want to be a better man. I would not trade a single moment of our life together, not even the hard parts." "I love you," Victoria said, as she had said countless times over the years, but the words never lost their meaning. "I love you too," Hayes replied. "My voice of reason, my partner, my love." They stayed up late that night, talking and laughing and making love with the ease and passion of a couple who had grown to know each other deeply. Victoria thought about the girl she had been when she arrived in Seligman, wounded and uncertain, desperate for a place where she could be herself. She had found so much more than that. She had found a home, a purpose, and a love that transformed her understanding of what was possible. The years continued to unfold. Henry grew into a thoughtful, intelligent boy who loved books as much as he loved horses. Violet was fierce and independent, already showing signs of her mother's determination. Samuel was the sweet one, gentle and affectionate, happiest when he was helping his father with the animals. Victoria's students grew up and went on to various futures. Some left Seligman for opportunities elsewhere, armed with the education she had given them. Others stayed, building lives in the territory, and Victoria took pride in watching them become teachers, ranchers, businesspeople, parents. Several of her female students went on to become teachers themselves, carrying forward Victoria's belief that women had valuable contributions to make to society. The cause of women's suffrage progressed slowly, but steadily. Wyoming Territory had granted women the vote in 1869, before Victoria ever came west, and other territories followed. Victoria lived to see Utah Territory grant suffrage in 1870, though it was later revoked, and Washington Territory granted in 1883. She knew the fight was far from over, but progress was being made. In 1893, when Victoria was 39 and Hayes 43, Colorado became the first state to grant women's suffrage through a popular referendum. Victoria and Hayes traveled there to witness the celebration, bringing their 3 children to see history being made. Standing in the crowd, watching women cast their votes for the first time, Victoria wept with joy. Hayes held her hand tightly, tears in his own eyes. "You helped make this happen," he told her. "By teaching, by writing, by refusing to be silent. You made a difference, Victoria." That evening, back in their hotel, Victoria wrote a long letter to the women's suffrage leaders she had been corresponding with for years. She shared her story, how she had been banned from speaking her mind in Boston but had found a voice in the West, how a cowboy had told her she deserved to be heard and had spent 20 years proving he meant it. She wrote about the power of partnership, of men supporting women's rights, of building a better world together. The letter was published in several suffrage newspapers, and Victoria received responses from women across the country, thanking her for her story, sharing their own. It reminded her that she was part of something larger than herself, a movement that was changing the world slowly but inevitably. As Victoria and Hayes entered their later years, they watched their children grow into adults with their own dreams and ambitions. Henry went to university in California, studying law, determined to fight for justice through the legal system. Violet became a teacher like her mother, but also a vocal suffragist, even more outspoken than Victoria had ever dared to be. Samuel chose to stay on the ranch, taking over more of the operations as Hayes grew older, but he did so with a progressive mindset, treating his workers fairly and implementing new techniques. In 1912, Arizona became a state, and with statehood came women's suffrage. Victoria was 58 years old, and she cast her first legal vote with tears streaming down her face. Hayes stood beside her, his hair now gray but his love for her as strong as ever. "I wish everyone could see this," Victoria said as they left the polling place. "All those people who said women should not have a voice, who said we were not capable of making informed decisions, I wish they could see how wrong they were. Some of them are seeing it," Hayes pointed out, "and those who are not are being left behind by history. You were right, Victoria. You were right all along." That night, they sat on the porch of their ranch house, which had been expanded and improved over the years but still held the bones of the structure Hayes had built before Victoria came into his life. They held hands and watched the stars, the same stars that had shone on their first evening together, and reflected on the life they had built. "If I could go back," Victoria said quietly, "and tell that frightened girl getting off the train in Seligman what her life would become, I do not think she would believe me. She was so afraid, so hurt from being rejected. She could not have imagined finding someone like you, building a life like this." Hayes squeezed her hand. "If I could go back and tell the lonely cowboy who walked into Walter's store that day that he was about to meet the love of his life, he would have been terrified. I had no idea how to love someone like you deserved to be loved. I had to learn as I went." "You learned well," Victoria assured him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You loved me better than I ever dreamed of being loved." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes after decades of being together, of knowing each other so deeply that words are not always necessary. "You have any regrets?" Hayes asked eventually. Victoria considered the question seriously. Her life had not been easy. There had been struggles and disappointments, battles lost along with those won, moments of doubt and fear. But when she weighed it all against the love she had known, the children she had raised, the students she had taught, the causes she had advanced, the answer was clear. "No," she said firmly. "No regrets, not a single one." "Me neither," Hayes agreed. "Not from the moment you walked into that store and looked at me like you were daring the world to try and break you one more time." They laughed together, remembering that first meeting, how young and uncertain they had both been. It seemed like a lifetime ago, which in many ways it was. They were different people now, shaped by experience and time, but the core of who they were and what they meant to each other had never changed. In 1920, when the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, guaranteeing women's suffrage nationwide, Victoria was 66 years old. The celebration in Seligman was joyous, with people gathering in the town square to mark the historic occasion. Victoria was asked to speak, and she stood before the crowd, Hayes beside her as he had been for 43 years, and shared her story one more time. "I came to this town in 1877, she began, her voice still strong despite her age, as a woman who had been silenced for speaking her mind. I was afraid, alone, and unsure if I would find a place where I could be myself. But I found more than a place. I found a community that eventually embraced me, students who challenged and inspired me, and a man who believed that my voice deserved to be heard." She turned to look at Hayes, seeing the love still shining in his eyes, seeing the man who had supported her through every challenge and celebrated every victory. "He believed it when I did not believe it myself. He stood beside me when it would have been easier to stand back. He built a life with me based on equality and respect, long before the law recognized that such a thing was possible. That is what I wish for all of you, for all the young women in this crowd. Find partners who see you as equals, who celebrate your voices rather than silencing them. That is how we build a better world." The crowd erupted in applause, and Victoria saw young women weeping, saw men nodding in agreement, saw the change she had worked so hard for reflected in the faces around her. It was a moment of pure triumph, made sweeter by having Hayes there to share it. That evening, back at the ranch, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Victoria and Hayes reflected on how far they had come. Henry was now a successful lawyer in San Francisco, fighting for workers' rights and social justice. Violet was a prominent suffragist and educator, traveling the country giving speeches. Samuel had turned the ranch into a model of progressive agricultural practices, treating workers fairly and implementing conservation measures ahead of their time. "We did good," Hayes said, watching his family laugh and talk around the dinner table. "Did not we?" "We did very good," Victoria agreed, squeezing his hand under the table. They lived many more years together, watching the world continue to change, watching their grandchildren grow up in a world where women's voices were legally recognized, if still not always respected. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1927, a milestone few couples reached, surrounded by friends and family who had witnessed their love story unfold over half a century. Hayes passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1929, at the age of 79. He died as he had lived, with integrity and grace, his hand clasped in Victoria's. She held him as his breathing slowed and stopped, and though her heart was breaking, she felt gratitude for every year, every day, every moment they had shared. At his funeral, Victoria spoke about the man Hayes had been, about his kindness and courage, about how he had seen her when she felt invisible, about how he had loved her without trying to change her. She spoke about the ranch he had built, the family he had raised, the community he had served. And she spoke about his fundamental belief that all people deserve to be heard and respected, regardless of their sex or station in life. "He made me brave," Victoria concluded, her voice breaking but strong. "He made me believe in love as partnership, as equals choosing each other every day. He was the best man I ever knew, and I was blessed beyond measure to be his wife." Victoria lived another 7 years, remaining active in her community, still advocating for causes she believed in, still teaching when asked, still writing letters and articles about women's rights and social justice. She divided her time between the ranch, which Samuel now fully ran, and visiting her other children and her many grandchildren. She passed away in 1936 at the age of 82, surrounded by family, her mind clear and her heart at peace. Her last words were about Hayes, how she was ready to see him again, how she had missed him every day since he left. Victoria's funeral was held in the same church where she had fought for her position as a teacher, where she had married Hayes, where she had celebrated so many community milestones. The church was packed with people whose lives she had touched. Former students now middle-aged, women she had mentored and inspired, men who had learned from her example that women's voices mattered. Her daughter Violet gave the eulogy, speaking about her mother's courage and conviction, about how she had never backed down from what she believed was right, about how she had built a life of meaning and purpose in the face of enormous obstacles. Violet spoke about her parents' love story, about two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful together. "My mother always said that she was saved by a cowboy who told her that her voice deserved to be heard," Violet said, tears streaming down her face. "But the truth is, they saved each other. My father needed someone who would challenge him to think bigger, to be braver, to see beyond the limitations of his time. And my mother needed someone who would stand beside her, who would never try to silence her, who would love her for exactly who she was. Together, they showed us all what love could be when it was based on respect and equality. That is their legacy, and that is what we must carry forward." Victoria was buried beside Hayes on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and harsh and free, exactly the way they had loved it. Her tombstone reads simply, "Victoria Barnes Coleman, 1854–1936, teacher, advocate, beloved wife and mother." Underneath, at Violet's insistence, was carved, "Her voice deserved to be heard." In the years after Victoria's death, her story became part of Seligman's history, told and retold to new generations. The school she had taught in was eventually replaced by a larger building, but a plaque was placed there commemorating her service. Her letters and writings were collected by a university library, studied by historians interested in women's experiences in the West. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward her commitment to justice and equality, becoming teachers, lawyers, activists, and community leaders. The ranch remained in the Coleman family for generations, a testament to what Hayes had built and what he and Victoria had sustained together. And in a small display in Seligman's Historical Society, there was a photograph of Victoria and Hayes from their 50th anniversary, both gray-haired and weathered by time, but still looking at each other with the same love that had sparked between them on that first day in 1877. Their love story became legend in the small Arizona town, a reminder that the West had been built not just by strong men but by strong partnerships, by people who recognized each other's worth and chose to build lives together based on mutual respect. It was a story about courage, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, about refusing to be silenced, and about the transformative power of being truly seen and heard by another person. And it was a reminder that sometimes the most radical act was simply to love and be loved as equals, to build a life where both voices mattered, where both dreams were honored, where both people could be fully themselves. That was what Victoria and Hayes had given each other, and that was the legacy they left behind, a legacy that rippled out through their children and grandchildren and all the lives they had touched, changing the world one person at a time. In the end, Victoria had been right all those years ago when she told the school board that she deserved to speak her mind. Her voice had mattered. It had taught children, inspired women, challenged injustice, and helped move society toward greater equality. But perhaps the greatest testament to the importance of her voice was that Hayes had heard it truly, had valued it, had spent his life making sure others heard it too. And Hayes had been right when he told Victoria that her voice deserved to be heard. It did deserve it, and by ensuring that it was heard, by standing beside her and amplifying her message, he had helped change not just her life but the lives of countless others. Their story was a love story, yes, but it was also a story about respect, about partnership, about two people choosing each other and choosing to build something beautiful together despite all the obstacles in their way. It was a story about the West, about the harsh land and the strong people who tamed it, about the opportunities and challenges of frontier life. But most of all, it was a story about the power of believing in another person, of seeing their worth when the world tried to diminish it, of standing beside them through every storm. Victoria Barnes had been banned for speaking her mind, but a cowboy named Hayes Coleman had told her that her voice deserved to be heard, and in doing so, he had changed both their lives forever. Together, they had built a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that carried on their values, and a legacy that reminded future generations that everyone deserves to be heard, everyone deserves respect, and love, in its truest form, is always about equals choosing each other freely and celebrating who they are.